Bruce, you must have something really good too.
Of course I do. It's Bruce Danielson, and I guess I'm here to entertain you too. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Tuesday afternoon, February 19th Land Use Committee meeting. Its first item of business is approval of minutes from Tuesday, November 20th. May I have a motion?
Move approval.
Second, Erickson.
Okay, everybody in favor say yes.
Yes.
Yes. Opposed, same sign. Okay, motion carries unanimously. Our first report is the Shape Places zoning ordinance amendment, and Mr. Jason Bieber, our urban planner, is going to present on that item. Welcome, Jason.
Good evening. First, thank you for the opportunity for us to come before you to kind of discuss some of these minor amendments that we're looking to propose to have come before you here in about a month. Jason Bieber, representing Planning and Development Services. As you know, we do like to do some amendments to the Shape Places ordinance, really look at it every 6 to 12 months, and then bring some things forward to you that we think need to be either amended or corrected within the Shape Places ordinance. So we can kind of get into some of our major things we're looking at this round. First, we're going to kind of go through a couple of definitions we're looking at updating and amending. One is a bed and breakfast. We're looking at having a requirement added to have them be licensed by the state of South Dakota as a lodging establishment. This kind of follows along with Airbnb and those different different kinds of lodging things we have within the city. And then also putting a restriction in there for no more than 5 bedrooms or no more than 10 guests per night. And that's specifically, most of these are in residential areas. You start getting over 10 guests, it's a lot of cars, and it becomes more of a nuisance on the neighbors, the single family residential neighbors that usually these are within. Second definition is we wanted to really clarify what a duplex is, that it's 2 separate dwelling units. Sometimes it got a little bit confusing what the difference between a duplex and a twin home was. We really wanted to just make that definition so people can understand it and they know the difference. Our other big definition that we're looking at adding is we're looking at adding a definition for primary form. And that definition that we're looking to add to the zoning ordinance is a form or forms most commonly used and best represents the category of land use on a parcel within a particular zoning district. And if you look at the sheet that I had highlighted on here, this is our form sheet that we usually hand out to citizens. Anybody can find this on our website. We already had primary forms called out within that sheet. However, we never had a definition within our definition section, so we decided to throw one in there. And then we can get into some specific form amendments that we're looking at. First one is we're looking at adding accessory daycare centers within MD forms. Those are apartments. We've really had this push specifically from the Boys and Girls Club to take some of these apartment community spaces and actually add daycares to there and after school programs, which we feel is a good use. And then they're not having to ship the kids to their locations. They're actually coming to where the kids need them. So we wanted to add that as an accessory use to allow them to continue to kind of do that throughout the city. We also wanted to add the AD4 form to a multifamily RA1 zoning district. As you know, the AD4 form is kind of some of these converted houses. And we found that a lot of the converted houses throughout the city were zoned RA1 already. And we were having to have them rezone it to the RT2 zoning district, so we figured why not just add it to that zoning district and save some time and hoops for these people to jump through. And then we also had bed and breakfast standards that were specifically under the form, so we had them under several forms and it just made the ordinance a little bit longer. So we actually just moved those back to the conditional use standards. They're required to get a conditional use no matter what, so why have them spelled out in the form, just have them in one place for all of them. We have, as you know, quite a few churches that are within the NF1 form. Those are kind of neighborhood facilities. That form actually only allows a 35-foot height limit, and we are running into issues with a lot of them because they have spires, they have steeples that go up a little bit higher. So we wanted to add, kind of eliminate those as they're allowed to exceed the 35-foot height limit, so we can still continue to have them in the NF1 form. And then we also wanted to allow assisted living facilities in the RE6 form. That's kind of our downtown area. Currently, they had to be above the first floor. This way, we're just adding them, and they can be on the first floor or above or wherever they needed to go. And then we also looked at some proposed landscape and buffer yard changes. We're always looking at that as part of this amendment. Some of the changes there, we're looking to allow trees as an option to screen drive-throughs from public right-of-way. Now, really what they're supposed to be doing is putting fences, and we didn't feel that a fence is maybe a very good way to have across, 41st Street. Kind of gives it more of the fortress-looking thing. So we wanted them to be able to have the option to do some ornamental trees, kind of screen that a little bit, but still make it look appealing. We're allowing trees to be grouped in clusters, but we also wanted to make sure we maintain some separation distances from those. I think it's 8 feet for coniferous and 15 for deciduous shade trees. And that's really just to make sure that they can continue to grow, but allow them to cluster them in their site wherever they wanted to put them. And then we also have run into several issues where we have power lines, and we required some deciduous shade trees under there, a certain percentage. Well, in about 10 years, those deciduous shade trees would grow so tall, power companies would have to cut them. So instead of doing that, we were proposing to allow ornamentals as 100% in those areas where there's going to be power lines. And ornamental trees usually don't grow much more than 10 to 15 feet. So hopefully that'll alleviate some of those issues. And then also we're looking at requiring plant type diversity in our buffer yards. Now you could provide just deciduous shade trees, you could provide just shrubs. We really wanted to make them do a little of everything, similar to this picture that we have here. This is kind of an idea of what we would like a buffer yard to look at. So we were just trying to promote that diversity. Excuse me. And then we also we're looking to allow required landscape units to be placed outside of the required yard when located within a drainage, electrical, and gas easement. And this would be administrative approval through our director. We've been running into a lot of trees that would specifically drainage easements, electrical or gas, where they can't be placed there. I mean, they just don't allow them to go there. Then we're making them go to planning commission to be able to have them move them to a separate area. So this way it just saves them that time, and it still meets the intent of the ordinance to place them in the front yard, but they're not within that easement. So, and that's kind of the the proposals we're looking at doing. I'd love to answer any questions if you may have them.
A very quick question. When do you see that you will be bringing these forward to the full council?
Yeah, great question. So we were proposing to go to the March, would be the March Planning Commission, and then we would see first reading the third Tuesday of March, and then second reading we're proposing for that first Tuesday in April. So. Okay,
thank you. Committee questions? Councilor Erickson.
Yes, I do. When we talk about some of the changes, which we need to be tweaking them and making them, especially if you're coming in front of the Planning Commission and the council, and we keep saying, do this, we're consistently creating a standard, and so it's important that we follow that, and so I support your efforts of enhancing this this plan. The first one, the adding accessory daycare centers in the MD forms, I think this is a fantastic idea. I've talked to the folks in Big Brothers, Big Sisters, or the Boys and Girls Club, I'm sorry. Yep. And with that, this will encourage and help get people there. And so I just think that's awesome to be able to do that. My question is when we make these changes from add the ADA form for this and the RA1 zoning, how does that impact current properties within our city? Will we have a bunch of city initiated changes for some of these because now we're moving the standard again?
Oh, this actually, the number 2 that you speak of should actually eliminate a lot of the city initiated rezonings. Okay. Because those are the ones that should be zoned RT2 currently, and a lot of those properties are actually zoned RA1, so this would allow them to be in their current zoning district without us having to go back and essentially correct them, so this should help some of that.
So if I can follow up it, so the one that's RT2,
yep.
Would we have to go back and change that to RA1?
No, but it'd be allowed in both of them.
Both of them are okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And then I have one more, if I can, Mr. Chair. The RE6, the move assisted living facilities to allow living on first floor. Again, to me, that just makes sense when you have assisted assisted living facilities, being on the main floor is a big deal. We're talking about our aging population, and so to be able to have those on the main floor is a good thing. So thank you for your efforts in this and for going through in so much detail.
Councilor Selber?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My quick question would be, are these ordinance amendments, are these done annually? Like, every year you get so much feedback about certain things that comes this time of year, you go, here's what we've heard, here's what we're going to change? Or
Yeah, great question. We typically like to do these every 6 to 12 months. Honestly, if we could do 2 a year, this one's probably 12 months from the last time we did it. It really depends on time. So when we find things that, we get from the public or we as a staff say, maybe that's not really the intent, we really just try and keep a list of them. And then when we get to a time where we have a little bit of free time and we can start putting these into ordinance, we really vet them throughout, our whole department to see if they work or not work. And that's really where we come up with the list for them to go forward.
So it's not like every February we come up with this, it's just a matter of it might be a few months down the road, some things are kind of piling up here, we need to address it and maybe change and then.
Absolutely, and we would probably do them more often if we really found one that maybe was more of an emergency that was really causing problems for specific citizens or developers, then maybe we would do it a little bit quicker. These ones weren't something that was too urgent, so sometimes then we wait a little bit longer, so.
Gotcha. Thank you, sir.
Councilor Staley?
Jason, right now, for someone wanting to operate a bed and breakfast, what does that entail?
Well, they would need a conditional use to go to Planning Commission, and we're not really changing much of that. We're just putting where we're putting those proposed standards, we're just changing where they're located at. Really, the biggest things that they would need to do is they have to live there. I believe it's got to be on the second floor, and they have to offer like breakfast. We also need them.
What has to be on the second floor?
The sleeping rooms have to be on the second floor, so we're trying to make it as the first floor is kind of a single where the owner lives. The second floor is kind of your bed and breakfast area.
So bed and breakfast cannot be, it has to be a two-story home?
Well, usually they're on the second floor. You can go for a conditional use to try and eliminate some of those criteria, but that's our criteria we try and look at. And then we want to really
Could you get, like, when you bring this forward, I'd like to have that available for the public to see what because I wasn't aware that there were these limitations. Keep going.
Yep, and if you actually look in the ordinance that I believe was provided in the back, that'll go through all those conditional uses. And then the other thing we really look at is, as I kind of talked about before, is we really want to make sure they have enough parking. Because as you know, neighbors become upset when there's cars parked all over the street with people staying at these bed and breakfasts. So we really want to make sure that they have parking for their guests.
Yes, but so, I mean, bed and breakfast doesn't mean that you have to have a historical house.
No, it doesn't. Typically, that's where we see them, obviously, but it does not mean you have to have a...
So you're saying if someone has a ranch-style home and they want to have a bed and breakfast, they're going to have to jump through a few more hoops than someone with a two-story house?
They'd already be required to go to Planning Commission, so that would be just something that we would go through Planning Commission with them on.
And then this registration with the license by the state, is that something new?
Yeah, I believe what we're looking at doing that, and I can get a little bit more information on that, is just trying to bring them in line with some of the other lodging establishments, like I said, with the Airbnb and stuff. They're all, so we can get them on a registry and know where they are, and make sure that they are registered with the state. So.
And do you have to have an ADA, like if you're doing an Airbnb, do you have to be an ADA compliant?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, I know you've done it, but I mean, do you have to can it be do you know, ADA?
That I'm not sure. I can definitely get you that information though before we come back.
So that, I mean, that if someone wanted to open a bed and breakfast, that we would say, well, you're going to have an elevator in your house to get to the second story.
That I'm not sure that they have to do that. Like I said, if they're doing some interior remodel, I'm assuming building permits would look at it, and I'll have to get you that information. I'm not exactly sure, so.
Okay, and how many bed and breakfasts do you think we have in Sioux Falls now?
Gosh, I'm trying to think here. I know the one I always see is the one that's on Phillips Avenue right before the railroad tracks. It's kind of that old Sears Craftsman house. I don't know if I've done another one since I've been here. I'm sure there are a couple here and there, but I
Oh,
can't.
you mean like, you think there's only 1 or 2 in Sioux Falls?
I would say there's 5, handful, to be honest. True bread and breakfasts, not Airbnbs and those type of things.
Oh, okay. And would there be a fee, is there a fee to have a bed and breakfast? Like, if you get the, I suppose with the registration with the state, you have to pay something?
Whatever the state would charge, there wouldn't be a fee for us except for the planning commission hearing that you'd have to go to for a conditional use, so.
Okay, thank you. Oh, one more thing, if I could. The duplex twin home, so help us, what's the difference? Twin home, duplex?
Great question. Duplex, usually see in the core area, that's where you have to me, the duplex would be you have the first floor is a unit, the second floor is a unit. A twin home is what we typically see as you kind of get in more of the suburban area. To me, that's where you have the 2 garages connected and there's a property line down the middle, so you actually own one side or the other. A duplex would be just one owner and you'd probably rent out a 1 unit to say you and 1 unit to Rick or something like that. So to me, that's the difference between them.
But a twin home doesn't have, they're still connected.
Yeah, usually they're up and down though, not side to side.
Really?
A twin home is side to side, a duplex is usually up and down.
Right, but along Western Avenue, are you calling those twin homes? There's a lot of, I'm going to say 26th Street, farther to the north, there's embankments there's blocks of these duplexes side by side. I used to live in one, a side by
Well, I
side.
think I know where you're talking about. I would probably call them duplexes. They're side by side, but they're not traditional twin homes where there's a property line down the middle. Those are rentals, so you don't own unit A and unit B. That's really what we're trying to get the difference.
So twin homes are never rentals.
They can be rentals, but they're separate. They're separate units, so you can own one and somebody else can own the other one. Or you can own both of them and rent out both of them, but there's a property line down the middle and a firewall, so they're completely separated.
Okay, thank you.
Councilor Erickson?
I just wanted to, on page 18 is the conditional use standard for the bed and breakfast establishment. And I just want to make it clear that Airbnb and VRBOs are not necessarily bed and breakfast. It's not an interchangeable word. If you go on the state's website, you'll see the license that they have for a bed and breakfast. And there's also, South Dakota codified law does define what a bed and breakfast is. So it is defined in state law, and it's not the same as what some would envision an Airbnb or VRBO. Oftentimes, the Airbnb and VRBOs are 2 days to 2 weeks to whatever somebody wants to rent those out. And so they're very different versus a short-term rental. And, speaking from experience, because that's my business, we don't do the 2-3 day thing. That's not in our business wheelhouse. We can do them. However, we focus on 3 months and up for us. So we're a little bit different in that aspect too, that we're not a bed and breakfast. We don't provide the food. We don't provide any of that. And so it's very specific. And, on here it says the dwelling shall provide a minimum of 1,800 square feet of floor area. I mean, you're not talking about a tiny space. It's a substantial amount of floor space for that. And, knowing that we only have 4 or 5 in those, I think it's nice that we have an area for them and that we also know which ones they are as, having them on the rental registration. It doesn't cost anything, but it's nice to know if somebody's not mowing their yard, or who do they contact, or how does that work with that. And so it's always nice to have them on that list, and I've seen great benefits from being on that list, from tenants that aren't maybe following the rules. And if I'm not there, I like to be notified so I can address it right away. So thank you. Just want to clarify that.
Councilor Staley?
But with the bed and breakfast, you have to live on site?
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep,
so
it's
that
kind
would
of-
be a difference too, wouldn't it? That, I mean.
There are a lot of Airbnbs that do live on site as well. So for example, a person will live in a home. I have a couple of friends that live in a home. They're not considered an Airbnb, and they're not considered a bed and breakfast, but per state definition, but they own their own home and they rent out a private bath and share the kitchen space and have their own bedroom, and they get a garage stall. And so you're really shared living with strangers, if that's what you choose to do. So if a person has an extra bedroom that's not being used, people will throw that on VRBO and Airbnb and the other platforms. There's many different platforms that you can throw it on, and co-live with folks if that's, suits your need.
But that could also be called just getting a roommate too, right?
It can, but people are using platforms because people will come in and do it for a week. They might only be in town for a week, and so they'll come and stay in your spare bedroom for a week.
Right.
You travel to Nashville, Tennessee, you can do the same thing. You can do a shared space, or you can do the entire space. And so the platform is another avenue for folks that want to rent those out, the ability to do that.
All right, Jason, thank you very much. We appreciate the presentation. We knew in 2014 when Shape Places was voted on, then eventually implemented, that there would be a lot of tweaking taking place. We've done that, and it's been less and less each year, and we continue to do it, which will probably mean that there's going to be less of it in the future too because of some of the proposed changes. So thank you for the presentation. Our next item is, again, keeping in the theme of Shape Places, Apartment Residential District Amendment by Councilor Greg Neitzer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Greg Neitzer, City Council. I'd like to discuss with you today a proposed amendment to the zoning ordinance dealing with three-story apartments. I've been working on this for quite a while, and I will tell you that what I've come up with changed quite considerably from what I started with, and that really had to do with a lot of discussion with stakeholders and thinking about the implications. The problem is that I'm attempting to address is that three-story apartments next to single-family and other lower density uses create a unique concern because of their height, their mass, and their scale. Just as a quick review, I'm just going to go over the three types of apartments, and I'm going to try to make this simple. A lot of times we use this lingo, and one of them is forms, and at its very simplest, a form in the zoning ordinance is essentially a box. It's a building and its use. So when I say form, just think about the building. It's just a building, more or less. The first form is the MD1 form, which is a small apartment. That can only be up to 2 stories in height, so that is not implicated here. It cannot be 3 stories, so that we're not addressing here. The second form is the MD2 form, which is the medium apartment, and that has up to 48 units per building. That can be 3 stories, it can be 2 stories as well. This particular form has been the subject of some controversy in the last couple of years. We've had 3 issues that we have dealt with that particular form. The next form is a large apartment form. That's the MD3 form. It can have unlimited units per building. That can be 3 stories in height. It can actually be unlimited if it's not near lower density uses. We haven't run into issues with this because typically planning would not propose or support this near single family or lower density uses, and when you see it built, it's typically going to be in a very higher density area. So that brings us to the MD2 form. This is the issue because it's the only form in the zoning ordinance that can be 3 stories and has such a small setback and buffer yard requirement when it's adjacent to lower density forms. When it's adjacent to single family, as we have seen, it can have a 15-foot setback, which is a level B buffer yard, which requires a 2-foot berm or a 4-foot fence. That requirement applies even if the MD2 form is 3 stories and will be next to single family homes. No other form in the zoning ordinance that it allows 3 stories can be that close to single family and lower density uses. The only exception being what they call the open forms, which is essentially farms, parks, cemeteries, golf courses that might just happen to have a very tall building somewhere on site, but are otherwise quite low density uses and not generally a problem. So real quick, these are the other 3-story forms in the zoning ordinance. I won't go through all of them, but I just want to point out that all of these other forms require larger setbacks and larger buffer yards. A level C buffer yard with a 30-foot setback, or even a level D buffer yard with a 45-foot setbacks. So apartments, business and community facilities, your big box retail stores, warehousing, and utilities, things like cell towers, things like that. All of those have a larger setback, and they can be 3 stories or more. So, proposed solution: increase the setback and the buffer yard requirement for the MD2 form when 2 conditions are met, and they both would have to be met. Number 1, the building is 3 stories in height, and number 2, the yard is contiguous to a lower density form. Now, what does that mean? Contiguous means next to, abutting, touching, or having a boundary that is coterminous. So in plain English, the apartment property would have to be touching your property, not separated by a right-of-way or a street. And I'm going to show you an illustration that's going to kind of hopefully help you here. So in this illustration, let's say that 3-story MD2 form, this is the proposed new development. If you look at single family number 1, it would not be required this larger buffer yard because there's a right-of-way in between. That right-of-way will present and will creates a natural setback because you're going to have at least 60 feet. In the other case, a single family number 2, which essentially shares a backyard with the 3-story MD form, here's where you would have to provide the little bit larger buffer yard. So here's the proposed amendment. It looks messy, but essentially it puts into code what I am proposing, which is a larger buffer yard. In this particular case, it's a 30-foot buffer and a level C buffer yard when it's 3 stories, and it's contiguous to DD1 through DD4 forms. In plain English, those are single-family homes, detached dwelling, single-family homes. And then if it is 3 stories in height and it's next to the AD forms, or a highway or a greenway, AD attached dwelling, so duplex, twin home, 4-plex, 8-plex. It goes up from a level A buffer yard, which is 10 feet, up to 15 feet, a level B buffer yard. So we just tier it up one more. So this amendment is narrowly tailored to achieve the desired objective while minimizing the risk of unintended consequences. Those unintended consequences are making projects financially infeasible, creating excessive regulations and requirements when there's no controversy. And I want to point out, looking back at all of the rezonings since Shape Places took effect, there was somewhere in the territory of 40 to 50 apartment rezones, most of which went through with no problem whatsoever. And so we have to be very careful about adding too much on to every single proposal, because we can add on requirements with conditions, we can't take away. So if we get too excessive with every project, you may end up with problems where now they're not going to pencil out, they don't have the buildable area, it financially isn't going to be feasible anymore, and in the worst case scenario, nobody had a problem with it anyway, and now it's not going to work. There's a couple other minor changes I'm proposing. The first is essentially a clarification, a common open space alternative plan. If you are building an apartment, if you are willing to do a common open space in the middle of your development, let's say where you have multiple buildings, if you will provide something like play sets and picnic tables and do a common area in the middle, you're allowed to reduce your setbacks on the outside and move those buildings closer to the property line. So you're getting a break on those setbacks if you do something in the middle. All this is saying is that a common open space alternative plan shall not reduce a required buffer yard. So point being, if you're required to do a buffer yard because you have, let's say, a single family home next to you, you couldn't push that building closer even if you provide that common open space alternative. Because under the code, if you were to interpret it a certain way, you could possibly do the common open space and then push that 3-story building closer. One other very minor correction, in the zoning ordinance for the parking reduction alternative plan, it says that any parking reductions must be reviewed as a variance through the Board of Adjustment, and having been on the Board of Adjustment, reviewing is essentially what we do every night when we look at a proposal, we review it, but that doesn't mean we're going to vote for it. So it's just essentially correcting the word reviewed and making it approved. It has to be approved, very minor. Input solicited, I talked to city planning staff, got a list of all of the rezonings that have happened since Shape Places took effect, all of the apartment rezonings, which was very illustrative, again, to look at them and look at the pictures and look at where they went and how much, actually went and looked at the planning commission meetings and looked to see what citizens said, if anything, and that was very revealing to see that most do go through without a problem. Sat down with all of those multifamily developers that you see listed there. Great conversations. These are stakeholders, and they were able to give me some really good things to think about as far as if you do this, this is how it will challenge this particular project or this. And they were, we came to a point where I think they were very supportive. And then finally, citizens and neighbors. I picked a selection of neighbors in some of these rezones that were contentious and solicited feedback from them, which was very valuable, and then I tried to balance all of that. So, in summary, this amendment is based on stakeholder feedback from all sides. It makes required setback and buffer yard for the MD2 form of 3 stories consistent with the requirement imposed by other 3-story forms in the zoning ordinances. It recognizes a desire in the feedback of citizens that they want a larger buffer when a 3-story apartment is that close to their property, but it's narrowly tailored to achieve the objective so that we minimize the risk of making projects infeasible or more costly for no compelling reason. And so I do want to reiterate, there would be some that may say, well, why not 45 feet? Why not 60 feet? Why not do it for every single one? These sort of requirements, if we impose them on all projects, could potentially make them infeasible. And remember, again, if there's a major problem, an outlier, we can address that with conditions, but we have no power to reduce the law once we put it into effect, besides obviously amending the ordinance again. And with that, I'll take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Counselor. Nice presentation. Counselor Erickson.
Thank you. Thank you, Counselor Neitzert, for your presentation, always very thorough. This is really, truly about affordable housing. I know that apartments have gotten a black eye recently, but apartments can be, quote, the American dream and what a person wants to live for maintenance free. And so this is making it feasible. And I appreciate how narrowly tailored it is as well. So it's just not real loose. It's very specific. My question to you, and it might not be for you, and maybe we can talk about it another time if I'm surprising you with it. How often do we require the bigger buffer zone when we've rezoned these? I mean, like I said with Jason earlier, I said, you know, we're oftentimes doing many of these things and adding on these additional requirements. So if we're already doing it and it's really become the new standard of increasing that buffer zone when we're right by those single family homes, I'm just curious as far as how often we've done that, and if you don't know, I apologize. You can get back to me.
Yeah, I'd have to look back at the numbers. I have all of them. I think the key would be to look and see what was adjacent to each one again. I don't have that all in front of me. Obviously, as you recognize, where it typically becomes a problem is when it's infill. Mm-hmm. I mean, when you're doing it, you know, when you're doing it out in the suburbs, and particularly if something hasn't been built yet. If it's zoned single family, but it hasn't been built yet, you many times aren't going to get a whole lot of, controversy. And by the way, that's something that was something that we had discussed and some had talked about too, was maybe you make a delineation between, whether the property next door has been developed or not. But then you run and you could go down that road, but you'd have to figure out what's going to constitute developed. Is it platted? Is it they pulled a building permit? Is it the building is there? So that gets touchy.
And you took the words right out of my mouth because, plans change. So if it's zoned next door, it's zoned egg. Maybe the plan in 5, if it's in the tier system, it could be planned for residential, maybe not. If it's zoned residential, but there's sitting vacant land, that could eventually change too and be phase 2 of the apartment buildings or whatever it is. So I would be curious with that balance too. But like you said, this would be the minimum standard. And if we need to address the outliers in the future, that's something that we can certainly look at too. So.
And I will tell you, the thing that I really had to balance was the strong desire from citizens saying they don't want an apartment that close to their homes, but you also have all of these other developments where there's not homes there. And again, we can add conditions, and 15 feet may not sound like a lot, but if you start talking about 15 feet and you have multiple yards, for example, you have maybe homes on 2 or 3 sides, and you have to start moving in all of these setbacks, you start losing a lot of buildable area, which means less units, and a project that might have penciled out before now isn't going to pencil out, and it might not work. And the worst case scenario again would be, let's say it's a project that normally would pencil out, now it doesn't because of you went too excessive with your setbacks and nobody was going to object to it anyway.
Right. Thank you.
Any other questions for Counselor? Counselor Staley?
Thank you for addressing this. That it's very considerate of you. You're thinking beyond the scope of where we're at. You're trying to reach out and help people. I applaud you for that, Greg. And it has been contentious. And many times I've been on the side of the homeowners. I just want a clarification, first of all, in your summary. Are you saying that a three-story apartment building can now be 10 feet closer to a homeowner than another homeowner?
Yeah, so what I'm saying is the required setback for a residential single-family home is 25 feet. That's how far your home has to be from the property line. But an apartment can be as little as 15 feet.
Oh my gosh, I did not realize that. Thank you for pointing that out. That is, I'm going to write that down. Okay, so back to, and again, you're trying to find a solution for this because it is a problem. I'm saying to people, homeowner beware. You may have been told when you purchased your home that it was going to be the real estate person saying, well, this field is going to be turning into something compatible with where you're living. Beware, because that ain't true necessarily. The city may have even told you years ago, it's going to be this and this. Get it in writing is what I'm saying. But when you were talking to the Brett and 85th people, you talked to the people who are going to have these apartments, where are we at with that development? Have they started breaking ground yet?
No, the Costello, from my understanding, has not even filed the paperwork to request the affordable housing credits. I think what they're waiting on is they're waiting for that road to be built out. They're waiting for some of the infrastructure. So it's going to be a few years yet.
So you talked to the people on the south side of that?
I did talk to one of them, I believe. I tried to pick some people who were very vocal and had a lot of opinions at the time. I tried to pick at least one from each of those three, and in some cases there was 2 or 3.
So, because right now it's 20, I believe it's 20 feet from the property line.
40 feet on the south property line was a condition we imposed.
I
And then
thought from their property it was 20 feet.
It was 40 feet, as I recall. And then there was also the setback to the rural residents.
Right.
So there's 2 of them, and that one I don't believe we added a condition to, so I don't recall, but
So if,
that did not have the 40.
okay, well, I thought it was 20, okay, so at 40 feet, so how is this change going to help them? I mean, if we could go backward in time, how would this have impacted them?
So in that particular case, our starting point would have just been 30 feet, and we would have just added another 10 feet.
So that, it wouldn't have made a difference for them?
No, but I would say that in the zoning ordinance, and you're not trying to address the outliers. You're trying to address all of the majority of them out there, and then that's why conditions are for in the very extreme case. For example, if we required 40 feet in every apartment zoning, we would create major problems in making many of them work. So that's,
How about like the Oscar Howe people? What would the discussion be with them on this?
The discussion would be, it would have started at 30 instead of 15. And then we added whatever it was, which was the largest setback, I think, in my recollection that's ever been imposed.
So in essence, what you're changing here wouldn't, if this gets implemented, wouldn't really have affected these people?
No, it would not have.
So-
But those, again, are the outliers. This is more about just saying that the community value is that, in general, apartments of 3 stories should not, by default, be that close to a single-family property or low density.
And
just a community
and for
standard.
the record, what I'm hearing people talk about, and even we'll be talking about possibly having an apartment in the middle of a central neighborhood by where I live. Not close enough to recuse myself, of course, but we're going to be talking about that tonight. Where do we draw the line between what fits into a residential area? I know you're very committed to apartments, but also I'm committed to protecting the integrity of a neighborhood too. And if we would, let's say we have a fire in your backyard and 3 of your homes, homes burned down in your backyard, you could potentially have a multi-housing unit built back there, right? If it could get rezoned?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's like, it's all in flux right now, and we're saying we got to have big apartments next to small homes, and I think it's a discussion, I'm glad we're having it. I think we're going to have to continue to have this discussion about what fits where, and, how we're going to house people and affordable living.
Absolutely. Then there's always a tension in the zoning ordinance between property rights and the rights of the neighbors, and there's a tension between preserving neighborhoods and the character that's there, but we also have to think about the affordable housing component, and as a community, are we going to be successful if we're only going to say you can only put an apartment on the fringe of the city where there's no public transit, and we have to build more infrastructure, so it's a constant wait. The other thing I do want to really quickly point out is I don't want to leave the impression that there was an error in the zoning ordinance in the fact that single family has a 25-foot setback and apartments have a 15-foot setback. There's a very good reason for that. Single family by definition is supposed to be low density. So if you build a homogeneous low density neighborhood, you're supposed to have not a whole lot of housing, which is why you have those setbacks, and you're not supposed to have houses crammed up next to each other. Whereas apartments by definition are higher density, so they have lower setbacks. So you would have, in a homogeneous apartment district, you would have apartments tighter together because they allow more units. So of course you need to have less setbacks because you got to get more units in there. The issue comes in when you start putting them together, the single family and the apartments, and that's where buffer yards come into play, and that's what this is trying to address. So.
Councilor Selberg, do you have anything?
Well, I just say, yeah, it obviously it addresses affordable housing. It's just one of the most important factors in a number of these things that we've been facing over the last few months or throughout our term. And then when you talk about the setbacks and the buffers, and like you say, even the smallest thing, you think 15 feet, well, what's the big deal? And then we've seen how big a deal it is in some of these topics and some of these projects that have come in. So, and then you talk about the fine line that you have to walk when you add in some of these things that you're talking about, because like you said, you have to be careful what you add on because you can't take it off. So I don't know, it takes a very, you certainly give it a lot of thought and due diligence. It takes a lot of, what you're good at, thorough, this is right in your alley and I'm glad you're tackling it. So I don't really necessarily have a question, maybe then to just reiterate what the others have said a bit. You're tackling things that are hitting right at the heart of a lot of things that we're talking about every week. So I guess good job is pretty much the basis of what I wanted to tell you. So
I appreciate it, and I would just say that, yes, if you saw the first drafts and what hit the cutting room floor, vastly different from what you see here. And that was because of that feedback and looking at the numbers and just kind of thinking about how these projects work, that we don't want to make it so inhospitable that you can't, build. We need units. We need multifamily. This is not an attack on multifamily. This is just trying to strike the balance. So,
Councilor Staley.
Now, one more question. In where you live, I was out there a few years ago. I noticed you have apartments there, but they seem like they were put in a certain place in the neighborhood, right? They're in a, what do you call that? Was at one point in the development, did they say we're going to have our residential places here? And then there was, I didn't see any apartments that were right in the same block as a residential area. Do you think that was definite planning to say this is where we'll have our apartments here?
yeah, there's a pretty good transition from single family, and then like a block away or even on the other side of my block, you have twin homes, and then you go across the street and then you get into the 8 and 16 plexes. So yeah.
Yeah, and as I drove through that, to me, it gave me a peaceful feeling. I thought this is well laid out. This makes sense. You're not shoving this on top of somebody's backyard. So that's the thing I think we need to be looking at with the outer parameters is how do we transport people? Yes, like Brett and 85th, we're going to have workforce housing in that place. That's out there, isn't it? We're going to have to find a way for those people to get to their jobs. But also, just in the whole development scheme is, why don't we have a terraced approach? I think at one point we did, and it maybe.
Oh, I think that's obviously always the goal. But in a perfect world, it would always be an orderly transition of single family to, 2 plexes to 8 plexes to 16 plexes. But obviously, things don't always, work like that. So you run into issues where, again, you have issues where you might have pockets where you have a big plot of land on an arterial, and You're not going to put single family on an arterial, but you've got a few homes nearby, and now what do? It's a struggle, so.
Counselor, thank you very much. Well thought out. I appreciate the input that you solicited from city staff and our multifamily developers as well too, as well as our citizens and neighbors that have dealt with this issue. Very well thought out. So thank you very much for the presentation.
And if I may, just to answer a question that you had asked,
Yep.
Mr. Bieber.
Yes.
Same timeline.
Same
It will go to Planning Commission this next month, and then it would be hitting the City Council at the same time.
Makes sense to keep them together. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
All right, that takes care of that item. Now we're to our open discussion period of time. Anybody here for open discussion? Seeing none. Public input? Any public input, members of the committee? Okay, seeing none, I think everybody's hungry for pizza. So this meeting is adjourned.